Evening, everyone. I hope that you're very well. Tonight we continue our series in the Sermon on the Mount, and we come to perhaps, if not the most controversial passage in the Sermon on the Mount, at least by today's standards, and that is the section on divorce. And this finds itself in the 6 "you have heard it said" statements that Jesus is speaking to his disciples, and this is done to teach his disciples that they are in need of an external righteousness apart from themselves, and that they are not as righteous as they think they are. But it was also done to correct the teaching, the misteachings that existed at the time, and to show the fullness of the law. And so as we read today's passage found in Matthew chapter 5, verse 31 to 32, I just want to say two quick things regarding this topic of divorce. Number one, I'm fully aware that there may be some who may disagree with where we would go from the scriptures tonight, and please, I would just encourage you, please feel free to contact us at the office, and it would be great for you and I just to continue having a discussion around this and just sharpen each other in that way. Secondly, there is a stigma that is attached to divorce, and divorce is not the unforgivable sin. We know that unfortunately many have been divorced, and some may even be going through divorce right now. And just want to say that although it is not the plan of the Lord for divorce, it is part of living in this fallen world. And I just want to encourage us as Christians to be gracious towards those who have been divorced, who have walked through divorce and maybe even walking through it now, that we would be a balm of grace to those who are hurting. And so let's read Matthew chapter 5, 31 to 32. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So straight away we see that the statement is this: anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. Now, what was the certificate of divorce and why was it necessary? The certificate of divorce was necessary to protect those who were getting divorced, so that they would not be accused of adultery. And as we looked at yesterday, adultery was the sin punishable by death. And so the certificate of divorce is found in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1 to 4. Let's read it together. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, and after she leaves his house and becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon yourself or the land the Lord is giving you as an inheritance. And so the first thing that we need to look at is, as we look back on the basis for the statement that Jesus makes about the certificate and you've heard it said, is we need to realize that this passage was not actually speaking about divorce. It was not condoning divorce or commanding divorce. What was it doing? It was done to regulate the issue of remarriage. You see, men at the time were divorcing their wives and then just remarrying the next woman that would come along. And so it had deteriorated to such a devastating degree that the Lord, speaking through Moses, would put this command, this law in place about the certificate. And so it is done to show the sanctity of marriage, but also done to protect these women. Because these women, once they were divorced, were then left out, and the society were left to look after them because their husbands had neglected them, who were supposed to look after them. And so we see here in Deuteronomy 24 verse 1 that if the husband finds something indecent about his wife, then he is to divorce her, then he can divorce her. And so Moses puts this requirement in place that you couldn't just do it at a whim. Now, we must notice straight away that this indecency was not adultery. Why? Because as we spoke about yesterday, Leviticus 20 verse 10, adultery was punishable by death. And so this was a separate issue. And so what was this issue of indecency? The problem is that we do not understand the Hebrew around this, for it literally translates to the nakedness of a thing. And so we do not know what this was in reference to, but we know that the indecency was a serious matter. Moses says that if you get divorced, you are to give her a certificate stating divorce so that she wouldn't be suspected of adultery and thus face the punishment of death. But he carries on and he says this, that if you get remarried, that woman would then be entering into an adulterous relationship. But it would not only be the woman who would be entering into an adulterous relationship, the man would also be entering into an adulterous relationship. And so what Moses is doing here is he is saying that divorce is the end of the marriage and you are not to be remarried following that. And so this is not an endorsement of divorce. This is not an encouragement of divorce, but in fact this is a means to control the pandemic of divorce that existed at the time. And so to summarize, the divorce legislation in the Old Testament was that adultery was punishable by death, and that divorce was only permitted under the severe case of indecency. And even then, it resulted in the defiled relationship if the persons involved were then remarried. Why does God much about divorce? Because it is a shadow of our relationship to Christ. Ephesians would show us this, in that as Christ is the groom who lovingly lays down his life for the bride, and we as the bride, the church, are to surrender and submit before him in service and love. And so in the same way, husbands are to love their wives and lay down their lives for their wives, and the wives are to submit and love their husbands. And throughout the scripture, from Genesis to Revelation, marriage is a picture of something beautiful, and it is pointing to our relationship to the Lord. And so divorce destroys that. It detracts from the beauty of that relationship. And so it was never in God's plan. And so that shows us where we get the statement of the certificate of marriage from the Old Testament. But what were the Pharisees and the scribes and the teachers of the law teaching about divorce and remarriage? We find this in Matthew chapter 19, verse 1 to 10. Now, when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee and entered the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and large crowds followed him, and he healed them. And the Pharisees came up to them and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful for one to divorce one's wife for any cause?" He answered, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And he said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his wife, and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?" Now listen to verse 8. Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery." Now, did you catch in verse 3 how the Pharisees phrased the question? Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? This was the common teaching of the day. You see, their sinful hearts had led them to be exactly the same as the men and the women that Moses was confronting in Deuteronomy chapter 24. They were not divorcing their wives for legitimate indecency, whatever that may be, but they were seeking divorce at a whim. Culturally speaking, there were men who divorced their wives because of burnt food. It had gotten ridiculous, and so Jesus steps in to put a measure to this, and he says in Matthew chapter 5, Unless there is sexual immorality, then you may not get a divorce. And that the only reason that Moses had allowed this in Deuteronomy was because of their hardness of heart, as he states in Matthew chapter 19, verse 8. But the question remains, why does Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 say that you may get divorce for sexual immorality? I think that it relates to the damage that adultery does cause. And it's no coincidence that this is following on from the teaching of adultery and lust in the verses that preceded this. Lust and adultery are devastating. They break down the trust that is within a marriage. And unless grace would intervene there, that trust is broken. It is an act of God to restore that. Now, that being said, from a pastoral perspective, before I would entertain or even hear out teaching or thought of divorce, I would first want to encourage the husband, encourage the wife to look and to sit down and discuss grace, discuss the meaning of marriage, and to discuss reconciliation. For divorce is never the first option. In fact, I would hate to even encourage divorce or bring it onto the table, but the Lord does put forward that under sexual immorality, that breaking down of trust, then divorce is permissible. And so Jesus lays down the biblical not mandate, he lays down the biblical reason for legitimate divorce, and that is sexual immorality. But notice that he also would speak of remarriage at this point too. And so the question of remarriage does come up. I think it is clear from Scripture that the offending party within a divorce, the person who would be the adulterer or the adulteress, is not permitted to remarry. But the question that is asked is going, well, what of the innocent party in the divorce? What of the husband? What of the wife that was cheated upon? May they get remarried? And I think the answer to this is found in the Old Testament. As we said earlier on and yesterday, the punishment for adultery was death. And if your husband or your wife died, then you were legitimately allowed to remarry. And so if your husband or your wife was executed for adultery, then you were legitimately allowed to remarry. But what Jesus is doing here is he is giving grace to the offending party, and instead of calling them to be stoned, as was the culture in the day, we see this with John chapter 8, the woman being caught in adultery, about to be stoned. We see this even with Jesus' mother and Joseph, in that Joseph wanted to divorce her quietly so that she wouldn't be stoned for adultery as they were betrothed to be married. And so Jesus gives grace to the offending party that they would no longer be stoned, but that they would now get divorced. And in this case, I believe that the innocent party is able to remarry based on this logic. I think John MacArthur summarizes it really well in this following statement. If God permitted divorce rather than death as a merciful concession to man's sinfulness, why would he not also permit remarriage? Since remarriage would be perfectly allowable under the original law of death for the adulterer. After all, the purpose of divorce was to show mercy to the guilty party, not to sentence the innocent party to a life of loneliness and misery. And so I'm fully aware that that does not answer every single question that may arise within the topic. And I know that we would only have 10 to 12 minutes in an evening to cover these topics. And this is probably more of a sermon topic than a devotion topic. But I hope that we've covered the Old Testament picture of the abuse of remarriage. We've covered how Jesus corrects the teaching of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, and how he also shows grace to the offending party and grace to the person who has had adultery enacted upon them. All that being said, we are to realize that this is a topic that does carry weight behind it, and we are to walk in grace and truth. John 1:14 reminds us that Jesus was 100% graceful and 100% truthful. And in our attempts to stand for the truth as we have to, let us also remember that we are also called to stand with grace and love as well. And so I encourage you today, as your pastor at Tableview Baptist, I know that there may be some who have committed the sin of adultery. There may be some who have been divorced, some who have been remarried. And I know that there may be some who carry deep hurts in the midst of all of this. My goal is to encourage you, first and foremostly, for those of us who are married, fight for your marriage. Keep your eyes on your wife, keep your eyes on your husband as you would seek the Lord. Do not entertain the lustful thoughts that would lead to adultery. And guard your heart as you would honor the Lord in your marriage. For those who have sinned and fallen short in this way, fallen in divorce and others, I'd want to call you and remind you to the beautiful words that we see Jesus speaking to the woman caught in adultery in John 8. He says to her, "Woman, where are they?" Speaking of her condemners. "Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more." May we have that same heart as we finish reading the words from Ephesians 5, verse 22 to 30. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her with the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So far, may you be blessed and walk with the Lord in purity, holiness, and sitting under his word.